From New York, this is Democracy Now!
A partir de las 20 horas de hoy, jueves.
Starting at 8 p.m. today, Thursday, February 21st, the land border with Brazil will be completely and absolutely closed until further notice. It is better to prevent than to regret, to take all the measures for the assurance and protection of our people.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro closes the border with Brazil in an escalating standoff over whether to allow U.S.-backed so-called humanitarian aid to enter Venezuela. Trump's special envoy, Elliot Abrams, is leading a delegation to the Colombian border, traveling by military aircraft. We'll go to Caracas to speak with sociologist Edgardo Landere, who is part of the Citizens Platform in Defense of the Constitution. Then the movie Green Book is a top Oscar contender this weekend. It sparks renewed interest in the history of the Negro Motorist Green Book, a travel guide that helped African Americans safely navigate Jim Crow America. We'll look at a remarkable new documentary that tells the true story.
Very bad things happened to African Americans going down a dark country road. There was a sense of apprehension. You could actually be lynched.
Smithsonian Channel presents the real story behind the book.
The Green Book was a way to understand how you could get from A to B safely.
The Green Book, Guide to Freedom, details the violence, discrimination Black travelers faced on the road, as well as the pride and sense of community they felt in the safe spaces they created around the country, in the form of restaurants, hotels, and vacation retreats. We'll speak with the film's director, Yoruba Richan. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The North Carolina State Board of Elections has thrown out the results of November's congressional race in the 9th District and ordered a new primary and election after more evidence came to light of a Republican effort to tamper with absentee ballots. The race had pitted Republican Mark Harris against Democrat Dan McCready. Harris initially appeared to narrowly win, but the race was never certified. For months, Harris, a Baptist preacher, had insisted his campaign did nothing illegal. But on Thursday, he called for a new election. This came a day after Harris's own son, Assistant U.S. Attorney John Harris, testified he'd warned his father about hiring a longtime political operative who had a record of illegally collecting absentee ballots and in some cases filling them out in favor of Republican candidates. North Carolina's Democratic Governor Roy Cooper praised the board's decision, saying it, quote, sends a strong message that election fraud must not be tolerated. President Trump, who has repeatedly warned about Democrats stealing elections, has yet to comment on the latest news from North Carolina. A teacher strike in Oakland, California is entering its second day. On Thursday, some 3,000 Oakland teachers launched the strike, demanding fair wages, smaller class sizes, and more resources for their students. Jake Seltzer is a teacher at Met West High School.
On strike today to fight for students, the students in Oakland, and of course teachers as well. Like, we're fighting to make sure that public schools are sustainable. We're fighting so that teachers can have a living wage and can stay in the city. Like, the teacher pay is not commensurate at all with cost of living. I've taught in 2 other states, and the way that teachers are squeezed here is unlike the other places where I've taught, although it's been a struggle everywhere. We're also fighting for smaller class sizes for students. We're fighting for smaller guidance counselor ratios to students.
Calls are growing for Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta to resign. After a federal judge ruled Thursday Acosta broke the law in 2008 while working as a federal prosecutor for his role in securing a controversial plea deal for billionaire serial sexual abuser Jeffrey Epstein. The deal allowed Epstein to avoid a federal trial and possible life in prison and effectively ended an FBI probe into the case, which alleged Epstein sexually abused and trafficked more than 30 underage girls. The plea deal was then sealed in violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act. A recent Miami Herald investigation described the deal as one of the most lenient deals for a serial child sex offender in history. The deal also gave immunity to Epstein's co-conspirators. Epstein was known to socialize with many prominent figures, including Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. In news on Venezuela, the State Department has announced Trump's special envoy, Elliot Abrams, is traveling by military aircraft to the Colombian border as a standoff intensifies on the Venezuelan border. The State Department says Abrams will oversee the delivering of so-called humanitarian aid. This comes as Venezuela's self-proclaimed president, Juan Guaido, is insisting he'll lead a series of aid caravans across the border Saturday, but Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has rejected the aid efforts, saying they're part of a broader plan to overthrow his regime. Maduro has already ordered the closing of Venezuela's border with Brazil and is considering the closure of its border with Colombia. The United Nations, the Red Cross, and other relief organizations have refused to work with the U.S. on delivering aid to Venezuela, which they say is politically motivated. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Medea Benjamin, the co-founder of the peace group Code Pink, disrupted an event in Washington, D.C., where Guaido's envoy to the United States spoke.
So, Gustavo, please.
Excuse me, just a minute. Just as you were trying to take over the Venezuelan government, I want to say these people are fraud. They don't represent the Venezuelan people. They are representing the U.S. orchestrated coup. This is a very dangerous situation. They want to create a crisis at the border that would be a justification for U.S. intervention. This has nothing to do with a humanitarian situation.
In news from the Middle East, the White House has announced it will keep 200 troops in Syria. This comes just 2 months after Trump vowed to withdraw all 2,000 U.S. troops in Syria. The latest move was announced after President Trump spoke with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. At the Vatican, a historic summit on clerical sex abuse has entered its second day. On Thursday, Pope Francis called on bishops to, quote, listen to the screams of the little ones asking for justice. The summit takes place just days after the Pope defrocked U.S. Cardinal Theodore McCarrick after the Vatican found him guilty of sex crimes against children and adults. McCarrick was once considered the most powerful Catholic leader in the United States. On Thursday, the Archbishop of Manila, Luis Tagle, spoke at the Vatican summit.
Our lack of response to the suffering of victims, even to the point of rejecting them and covering up the scandal to protect perpetrators and the institution, has injured our people, leaving a deep wound in our relationship with those we are sent to serve.
Meanwhile, survivors of clerical abuse have been holding their own gatherings in Rome. This is Tim Lennon, president of SNAP, the Survivors Network of those abused by priests.
I was raped and abused by my parish priest when I was 12 years old. At the time, I froze, didn't say anything, didn't do anything. I was molested for several months and violently raped. I buried the memories for 30 years, or some memories, for 30 years. And it was only when other survivors, other advocates, stood in front of a church and said, there should be no more clergy abuse. And I said, that happened to me. And that was how my first realization of my abuse, that yes, this happened to me as well. More information has come to light about the white nationalist Coast Guard lieutenant who plotted to carry out a domestic terrorist attack. Investigators say Christopher Paul Hassan used his work computer at the Coast Guard to plan his attack. During the work time, he read the manifestos of mass killers and studied about how to carry out sniper attacks. At the time of his arrest, he had developed a hit list of prominent politicians and journalists and had stockpiled 15 guns and more than 1,000 rounds of ammunition. Robert Hur is U.S. Attorney for the District of Maryland.
Number and force of the weapons that were recovered from Mr. Hassan's residence in this case, coupled with the disturbing nature of his writings, appear to reflect a very significant threat to the safety of our community, particularly given the position of trust that Mr. Hassan held with the United States government.
The Southern Poverty Law Center is reporting the number of hate groups in the United States has reached a record high of just over 1,000. The group says the number of hate groups has jumped by 30% since Donald Trump launched his presidential campaign in 2015. In news from Arizona, federal prosecutors have dropped criminal charges against 4 members of the humanitarian group No More Deaths. The volunteers were arrested after searching for 3 migrants missing in the Sonoran Desert. But the activists have each been ordered to pay a fine of $250. This comes a month after 4 other members of the group were found guilty on charges related to their efforts to leave water and food in the harsh Sonoran Desert to help refugees and migrants survive the deadly journey across the U.S. border. They face 6 months in prison. A 9th member of the group, Scott Warren, is still awaiting trial on misdemeanor charges and felony charges. President Trump's longtime advisor, Roger Stone, has been barred from speaking to the media by a judge after he posted an Instagram photo on Monday depicting the judge with crosshairs next to her head. The judge, Amy Berman Jackson, also barred associates of Stone from speaking to the media on his behalf. Stone was indicted last month as part of special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation. He pleaded not guilty to lying to Congress, witness tampering, and obstruction. New government data shows U.S. banks made $28 billion in additional profit last year thanks to President Trump's new tax code. All told, U.S. banks made a record $237 billion in 2018. According to the Wall Street Journal, 2018 would have been a record-setting year for banks even without the additional boost from the tax bill. Meanwhile, the IRS reports the average tax refund for individual taxpayers has shrunk nearly 9%, also thanks to Trump's tax code. The pharmaceutical firm Catalyst is defending its decision to charge $375,000 a year for a drug that used to be available for free. The drug, Firdapse, is used as a medication for a rare neuromuscular disease. The price of the drug skyrocketed after Catalyst bought the rights to it from another pharmaceutical company which offered the drug for free through the FDA. Presidential candidate Senator Bernie Sanders recently criticized the company, accusing it of immorally exploiting patients who need the medication. In Spain, thousands of protesters rallied in the northeastern region of the country Thursday, calling for the release of 12 secessionist Catalan leaders who are on trial on charges of rebellion. In Barcelona, more than 13,000 people took to the streets.
Nobody should be judged for their political ideology in a democracy. I think it's unacceptable that the government keeps going on about the Constitution and does not allow these people to be free. That is why I am here.
At the trial, Catalan leaders have denied the charges against them, which stem from the 2017 independence referendum and the Catalan Parliament's Declaration of Independence. Jordi Sánchez is the former president of the Catalan National Assembly.
Me considero un preso político, este es un juicio político, y creo que mi...
I consider myself a political prisoner, and I believe that this is a political trial. I believe it's my obligation as a citizen who wants to tell the truth in a court that presents itself as being impartial to prove this innocence. And I am convinced that everything I am accused of by the prosecution is absolutely false.
In news from Latin America, Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega has vowed to reopen talks with political opponents for the first time in 7 months. The umbrella opposition group, Civil Alliance for Justice, said it will take part in the talks. The group said a key demand will be the release of hundreds of government critics who have been jailed over the past year. Meanwhile, a Nicaraguan farm leader who helped organize protests against Ortega last year has been sentenced to 215 years in prison. Medardo Morena was convicted in December of terrorism, murder, and organized crime. And Haitian human rights groups are criticizing the Haitian government for letting 5 Americans leave the country before they were scheduled to go to court for possessing illegal weapons. 2 of the Americans are former Navy SEAL officers. One is a former employee of the mercenary firm Blackwater. They were arrested February 17th. CNN reports the men were found to be in possession of 6 pistols, 6 automatic rifles, 2 drones, 5 ballistic vests, 3 satellite phones, a telescope, and several license plates. This comes amidst days of of anti-government protests in Haiti. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in Venezuela, where standoff is escalating as opposition leader and self-proclaimed President Juan Guaido claims he's preparing to deliver so-called humanitarian aid from the Colombian border Saturday. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has rejected the plan, saying the effort is part of a broader attempt to overthrow his regime. This comes as Trump's special envoy to Venezuela and right-wing hawk Elliot Abrams is leading a U.S. delegation traveling by military aircraft to the Colombian-Venezuelan border, supposedly to help deliver the aid. It's been 1 month since the U.S. recognized Guaido as Venezuela's new president in an attempt to oust Maduro from power. Since then, it's placed sweeping sanctions on Venezuela's state-run oil company and rejected calls for an international dialogue to resolve the crisis. The United Nations, the Red Cross, and other relief organizations have refused to work with the U.S. on delivering that aid to Venezuela, which these groups say is politically motivated. This is Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido speaking to Fox Business.
We will have a fantastic opportunity this Saturday to accept important humanitarian aid that the government in Venezuela has forbidden, and we have a fantastic example to pull our country out of this crisis.
On Thursday, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro announced plans to close the border with Brazil and possibly also with Colombia, ahead of the Venezuelan opposition's plans to bring in the aid despite his objection.
Starting at 8 p.m. today, Thursday, February 21st, the land border with Brazil will be completely and absolutely closed until further notice. It is better to prevent than to regret, to take all the measures for the assurance and protection of our people. I'm considering a complete closure of the border with Colombia. A prepared man is worth two. A prepared people is worth two.
Tonight, the Venezuela-Colombia border will be the site of dueling concerts, one organized by the British billionaire Richard Branson, the other by the Venezuelan government. This comes as U.S. Vice President Mike Pence is scheduled to visit Colombia Monday to demand President Maduro step down. Pence will deliver remarks to the Lima Group. Mexico is the only country in the group of 14 nations that has refused to recognize Juan Guaido as Venezuela's new president. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Medea Benjamin, the co-founder of the peace group Code Pink, disrupted an event there where Guaido's envoy to the United States spoke.
So, Gustavo, please.
Excuse me, just a minute. Just as you were trying to take over the Venezuelan government, I want to say these people are fraud. They don't represent the Venezuelan people. They are representing the U.S. orchestrated coup. This is a very dangerous situation. They want to create a crisis at the border that would be a justification for U.S. intervention. This has nothing to do with a humanitarian situation. Indeed, for a humanitarian situation, the U.S. would lift the economic sanctions that have exacerbated the crisis. The issue at the border now is something that is politicizing humanitarian aid. That is why the Red Cross, the United Nations, and all the legitimate humanitarian groups have insisted that they will not touch this aid. What we need now is negotiations. These people here want to take Venezuela to a path of civil war and U.S. intervention. What the Venezuelan people need is negotiations mediated by Mexico, I'm almost finished, mediated by Mexico, by the Uruguayans, and by the Vatican. So let's say that if you indeed care about the people of Venezuela, you will be calling for negotiations. You will not recognize these people who are willing pawns in a Trump-orchestrated coup d'etat. Thank you for listening to the Voice of Reason.
That was Medea Benjamin. Venezuela news conference in Washington, D.C. Well, for more, we go to Caracas, Venezuela, where we're joined by Edgardo Landera, a sociologist who's part of the Citizens Platform in Defense of the Constitution. Landera is a retired professor at the Central University of Venezuela. Because it's in Caracas, there is a long audio delay, so please bear with us. Edgardo Landera, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you describe the situation in the country right now and the effect of the pressure on the border?
Good morning, Amy. Glad to be with you. The situation in Venezuela right now is really quite tense. The 23rd, that is Saturday, when the so-called humanitarian aid is supposed to come into the country, according to Guaido's people, no matter what, presents a very serious threat to Venezuela, a very serious threat in terms of the possibilities of violence. This is certainly not some humanitarian aid. It's a humanitarian intervention. If the United States were really interested in democracy, if the government, of course, were interested in democracy, in human rights, and the humanitarian situation of the Venezuelan population, the first thing they would have to do is to stop the blockade that's impacting the Venezuelan people enormously, as the Venezuelan government has extreme difficulties in getting access to foreign markets. Its trade is made extremely difficult because the whole financial system is in one way or another controlled by the United States, and this blockade limits the possibilities of access to trade partners, etc. On the other hand, enormous amounts of money, billions of dollars in Venezuelan assets had been taken over by the U.S. government, and it's absolutely cynical that the U.S. government is claiming to be worried about the humanitarian situation of Venezuelans, offering a few $1 million when billions of dollars are being kept away from the Venezuelan government's capacity to respond to the deep crisis that the Venezuelans are facing. There is this threat of going into Venezuela no matter what. The hawks in the new cons that accompany Trump in these policies are well known. These are people like Abraham or Elliott or Bolton that have had well-known trajectories of military interventions in different places of the world. And obviously, there's no concern whatsoever for the lives of Venezuelan people. The situation is so tense that the 23rd could be the spark that starts a violent, even civil war situation in the country. So the absolute need to find some sort of solution, some sort of negotiation that would stop this escalation of violence is absolutely critical. And this has to be done soon because Saturday is a very critical day.
So if you can talk about the role of Venezuelans themselves in negotiating a solution, the possibility, the calls for the Pope to be involved. Of course, the Pope is originally from Argentina. The Pope to be involved, Mexico to be involved with the new president, AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And what about the people themselves in Venezuela? Your group, what is Citizens Platform calling for?
The Citizens Platform in Defense of the Constitution is calling for a referendum that has been established in the Venezuelan Constitution when issues of critical national importance have to be faced. This is a situation where we face a deep constitutional crisis. We have a struggle between the National Assembly on one hand and the executive on the other hand. They don't recognize each other as legitimate. And as a consequence, there is this tug in which politics is seen as an enemy-friend confrontation in which the purpose of policy is to destroy the enemy, to completely squash it. There's no will on either hand today to enter into some sort of agreement that would allow for the Venezuelan people to decide what they want their future to be. The Citizens Platform on Defense of the Constitution, as well as other groups, mainly from the left, but not only, have been arguing that we need this consultative referendum in order to have the Venezuelan people decide if they want to have new authorities overall in the country. That is, all the national powers, including the executive and the National Assembly. But that requires an agreement because we need a new National Electoral Council. The current Electoral Council is completely controlled by the government, and it's not trustworthy for the majority of the Venezuelan population. So we would need, as a first step, some basic agreement, a consensual National Electoral Council, and then this call for a referendum in which the Venezuelan people can actually give their own opinion and decide whether they want to keep the present authorities or if they want to completely renew the political system, not the structure of the system, but who's the president today, what's the assembly. As it is right now, the National Assembly is calling for the need for presidential elections, and on the other hand, President Maduro is calling for the need for new parliamentary elections. So none of the sides is willing to reach an agreement. We would, of course, need some sort of accompaniment by some international actors, and as you mentioned, the possibilities of having the presidents of Uruguay, of Mexico, maybe the Secretary General of the United Nations, and the Pope would be extremely critical in terms of the possibility of reaching such an agreement. So this requires these two things. On one hand, pressure and involvement by these people who are not interested in violence but trying to avoid a civil war, and this has been the statement of Uruguay, Mexico, the Pope. And on the other hand, pressure from the Venezuelan people to have this minimal agreement for a new electoral council and a referendum that would let people decide. There are reasons why there is huge, massive discontent in Venezuela in relation to the Maduro government. The crisis that the Venezuelan people are facing are, to a great extent, the responsibility of this government that has been extremely corrupt, inefficient, and has become increasingly repressive. But that in no way justifies a U.S. military intervention or this attempt to strangle the Venezuelan economy, which is, of course, doing much harm to the Venezuelan people than to the Venezuelan government. So in this situation where today, I would say a majority of the people in Venezuela reject the Maduro government, and on the other hand, a great majority also reject U.S. intervention. We need a negotiation that opens the way for Venezuelans to decide by themselves. And this is the option of both this negotiation with some international backing on one hand, and this referendum that we are calling for from the platform and other groups in Venezuela that think that the biggest threat for Venezuelans today is the threat of this escalation of violence, the possibility of a civil war, and the possibility that has been announced again and again of a military intervention by the United States government.
During his speech on Monday, President Trump called Maduro a, quote, Cuban puppet. This is what he said.
Incredibly, there are members of the Venezuelan military still barely supporting this failed dictatorship. They are risking their future. They are risking their lives and Venezuela's future for a man controlled by the Cuban military and protected by a private army of Cuban soldiers. Maduro is not a Venezuelan patriot. He is a Cuban puppet. That's what he is.
During his speech on Monday, Trump laid out what he called a, quote, ugly alliance between Cuba and Venezuela.
For decades, the socialist dictatorships of Cuba and Venezuela have propped each other up in a very corrupt bargain. Venezuela gave Cuba oil. In return, Cuba gave Venezuela a police state run directly from Havana. But this is a much different day, and those days are over. The ugly alliance between the two dictatorships is coming to a rapid end.
That was President Trump speaking in Miami Monday. A new book out this week by former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe reveals Trump privately discussed going to war with Venezuela in 2017. McCabe writes, quote, "Then the president talked about Venezuela. That's the country we should be going to war with," he said. "They have all that oil, and they're right on our back door." So, Edgardo Landera, as you speak to us from Caracas, can you respond to what exactly the U.S. is doing, who Guaido is, and this issue of humanitarian aid, the concerns of many? You have a plane that's been flying in back and forth, or planes from a company in North Carolina, apparently about 40 flights. The Venezuelan government found weapons stash, perhaps from one of those flights. It's a company that has previously worked with the CIA. The fact that the United Nations and the Red Cross have both said they won't work on this so-called humanitarian aid because it is politically motivated, and that is not humanitarian aid. What you think will be happening on the border with Elliot Abrams being flown in by military transport with his delegation to the Colombia-Venezuelan border, and the significance of Maduro closing the Brazil-Venezuela border and considering closing this border, the Colombia-Venezuela border.
Well, in the first place, I'd like to insist on the fact that this certainly is not humanitarian aid, and it's not oriented with any humanitarian aims. This is clearly a coup carried out by the United States government with its allies, with the Lima Group and the extreme right wing in Venezuela. The opposition, the right-wing opposition in Venezuela, the people who control parliament and the opposition parties have been weakened over the last few years, and they had not been able to agree on any single policy in relation to ways to confront the Maduro government. But now it's obvious that this very extreme right wing has been in close coordination with the United States government for some time now, and this script that has been followed since Guaido self-proclaimed himself as president is a script that's basically a U.S. script. And this script is on the works right now. There's no concern about the situation of the Venezuelan population because, as I said before, if you take away billions from the capacity of the government in Venezuela to respond to the needs for medicine and food on one hand, and you offer a few $1 million in food and medicine on the Colombian border, there's no proportion whatsoever, and it's clear that the purpose is not to respond to the situation of the Venezuelan population, but to create a conflict in the border. As people have been called by Guaido and his people to concentrate at the border, and this concert has been organized on the Colombian side of the government, this could lead to a confrontation between the two sides. The Venezuelan government has announced that it might close the border. It hasn't been decided yet, but the possibility of the closing of the border means that, as there is now, there's Venezuelan military presence in this side of the border, and there's obviously all sorts of paramilitary groups, CIA representatives, members of the armed forces of Colombia on the other side, and anything could spark some violence that could lead to the beginning of a confrontation. I don't think that Saturday will be the day in which a great confrontation will start, but it's a possibility that it could be the spark that could lead to increased violence and the possibility of a civil war. So we have to confront this supposedly humanitarian aid, which is not humanitarian aid, it's just direct intervention in order to have regime change, which has been the purpose of the Trump government from the very beginning. And we know what regime change has meant in other places. We know the experience of regime change in Libya. We know the experience of regime change in Iraq. We know what the people in Syria are facing today as a consequence of this imperial attempts to have regime change. So there's no possibility that this so-called humanitarian aid will make any positive contribution to the Venezuelan situation. It's just going to make it worse. And because it's deepening the crisis in terms of medicine and food for the Venezuelan people on one hand, it's increasing the likelihood of an escalation of violence, and it's opening up the doors to the possibility of a civil war. So the need for some sort of negotiation, for putting a stop to this escalation, and to put the blame on one hand on Maduro's responsibility for having, throughout this 6 years of government, created such an incredible collapse of the Venezuelan economy. Today, the economy is half of what it used to be when Maduro came to power. And this is basically the government's responsibility. U.S. sanctions against Venezuela, Trump's sanctions against Venezuela started a year and a half ago, around mid-2017. But the crisis came from way before. U.S. sanctions have deepened the crisis, but they are not the main cause of the crisis. The main cause of the crisis is ineptitude and massive corruption by the Maduro government. So we in Venezuela are faced with these two evils, with these two confronting enemies that have the Venezuelan people in between, paying for their own ineptitude, for their own violence, for their own political purpose, which are not the purposes of the Venezuelan population. We need to have some sort of pressure on the U.S. government to stop this level of intervention, this threat of military intervention, and we have to call on the Maduro government to be willing to open up a negotiation, because there are a lot of reasons why people in Venezuela don't really trust Maduro when he calls about his willingness to negotiate, because he always says the same thing. But when negotiations are always carried out, they are negotiations in which he has not been willing to do anything. He hasn't been willing to cede on any one basic issue.
Edgardo Landera, I want to thank you for being with us. Edgardo is a sociologist speaking to us from Caracas, Venezuela, where he's part of the Citizens Platform in Defense of the Constitution, a retired professor at Central University of Venezuela. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, Green Book, a guide to freedom. Stay with us.
Clavelito colorado, que de la mata cayó clavelito, todo lleno de rocío, como te cogiera yo, clavelito, clavelito, clavelito. La madrugada se ahoga en los esteros del hato. El alba toro araguato, el alba toro araguato, viene sin pica ni soga. Humitos ponen en boga sueños de café colado, le echa cuentos al ganado.
Lilia Vera performing Clavelita, Colorado. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. The Academy Awards take place Sunday. One of the top contenders for a number of Oscars for Best Picture, Best Actor, Supporting Actor, Screenplay, Editing is the movie Green Book. The film's inspired by the true story of a tour of the Deep South by the African-American classical and jazz pianist Don Shirley, played by Mahershala Ali, and his driver, Tony Lip, played by Viggo Mortensen. The movie has renewed interest in the history of the Negro motorist Green Book, and today we look at a remarkable new documentary that offers a real look at the history of a travel guide that helped African Americans safely navigate Jim Crow America. It details the violence, the insults, the discrimination Black travelers faced on the road, as well as the pride and sense of community they felt in the safe spaces they created around the country, in the form of restaurants, hotels, and vacation retreats. The film is called The Green Book, Guide to Freedom. This is the trailer.
Very bad things happened to African Americans going down a dark country road. There was a sense of apprehension. You could actually be lynched.
Smithsonian Channel presents the real story behind the book.
The Green Book was a way to understand how you could get from A to B safely.
That became a roadmap.
Right when you open up, it says, know your rights, and it goes state by state.
For some of the most significant people, successful businesses, and most important political milestones of the 20th century.
Owning an automobile was a big deal.
Having a car meant something, it meant that you had a ride.
Regular people populating something called middle class.
There were all kinds of businesses listed, just what you would find in a AAA guide, but also very telling in terms of how many areas of Black people were shut out of.
It uncovers the hidden truth about the African American community. It allows us to really just simply embrace the genius of us.
The Negro Traveler's Green Book.
The guide to travel and vacations.
Travel-wise people, carry your Green Book with you. You may need it.
That's the trailer for The Green Book, Guide to Freedom. The film premieres Monday on the Smithsonian Channel. For more, we're joined here in our New York studio by its writer and director, Yoruba Richin, a professor in the documentary program in the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. She also happens to be a former Democracy Now! Producer. It's great to have you back here, Yoruba.
It's great to be here.
Congratulations on this film.
Thank you.
Talk about the history and what inspired you to do this film.
So, let's see, there's so much history within the pages of the Green Book. The Green Book was created first published in 1936 by a man named Victor Hugo Green. He was a postal worker based in Harlem, and he had the idea for the book because of a Jewish friend of his had a guide for the Catskills, for Jewish families where they could go in the Catskills. And he looked at that and he said, hey, this would be a great idea. This is something that the Black community needs. He also was married to a woman named Alma who lived in Virginia, and they would travel down to Virginia. And he, experienced all the things that African Americans experienced at that time in terms of traveling. And so he created the Green Book.
You narrate this film, so I want to go back to the film as you describe and show this history of the Green Book.
Victor Green was a postal worker from Harlem, New York, one of the fastest growing African American communities in the country. But even in his own neighborhood, African Americans were unwelcome at many hotels and other establishments. And at Harlem's famed nightclubs such as the Cotton Club, where top Black entertainers like Lena Horne and Duke Ellington packed the house every night, Blacks were not allowed to sit in the audience. In 1936, Green created and published the first Negro motorist Green Book, which listed businesses where black customers were welcome.
The idea of the Green Book is to give the Negro traveler information that will keep him from running into difficulties, embarrassments, and to make his trips more enjoyable.
The Green Book started out only listing locations in New York, mainly in Harlem. Two of the most prominent were the Hotel Teresa and the YMCA, which served as one of Harlem's most important recreational and cultural centers. During the 1930s, dancers from the Cotton Club rehearsed at the YMCA. And many famous luminaries, such as writer Langston Hughes and boxer Joe Louis, stayed there. But the Green Book would soon outgrow Harlem. And by the time it ended publication, it had become more than just a travel guide. It had become a roadmap to some of the most significant people, successful businesses, and most important political milestones of the 20th century.
It's important to have everyone in this nation examine the significance of the Green Book. If you don't see the history, if you don't see where it was, how can you say it happened?
Eventually, the Green Book would list more than 9,500 places between its pages. Today, only about a third of those sites are still standing.
We need to find those places, and we need to see them, and we need to revere what they meant, because they made all of the difference to our survival.
Carry your Green Book with you. You may need it.
An excerpt of the Smithsonian's new documentary, The Green Book, Guide to Freedom. Our guest is Yoruba Richin, who is the filmmaker who made this documentary. You may need it. This was not just about where you could go to have fun. This was about where you could go to ensure you would survive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Traveling during that time for African Americans was, to say the least, a dangerous proposition. Not only was there segregation in the South, places where African Americans obviously, were not allowed to go, to eat, to sleep, but also the North and the West. So, there's this mythology that racism and segregation is confined to the South, or was confined to the South. That's not true. The North and the West had the majority of what we call sundown towns, places where African Americans had to get out, had to leave town. There were maybe signs, a bell might be rung for African Americans to leave the town. They were not welcome, and there was the potential for violence.
After midnight. In the daytime, they could work
Yes, they could work there, and then they had to leave.
In fact, that was also referenced in the Hollywood film Green Book.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which has been criticized for various reasons.
Right.
The perspective, it was told from the white driver's son. It was based on his book, and not as consulting Don Shirley's family, this remarkable pianist, classical jazz, who took this tour in 1962 through the South. But you definitely have the sense of violence he faced. And his going to, we'll talk about in the Hollywood film, the places he went to versus, well, all the places that are documented in the Green Book.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the most frustrating parts for me and for many people watching the Hollywood film, is that the film is called The Green Book. The Green Book is only a small part of the film, but the places that they went to were really not nice places. They were dumpy. Yeah, they were dumps. And that's not what was in the Green Book. That's not the extent. The Green Book had 9,500 listings over the period of 30 some odd years. And, one of those places was the Gaston Motel, the finest motel, Negro motel in the country. So that was a real misrepresentation. And the other thing...
In fact, we were just in Birmingham this weekend, the Gaston Hotel not far from the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, and they're talking about now renovating it and preserving it.
Yep, absolutely. It's really exciting. The other thing the film did was that the driver and Dr. Shirley only used the film, the book in the South. So when they were in the North and in the West, you didn't see them using the book. And then when they get to the South is when they use the book. And as I said before, that's not true. I mean, these listings were all over because African Americans had to navigate those dangerous roads all over the country.
We're going to break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some of these places like Idlewild and also talk about the role of Esso, the oil company. Yoruba Richin is the writer and director of The Green Book, Guide to Freedom, which will be premiering on Smithsonian Channel on Monday. Stay with us.
Ride on to your freedom. Make the northern state your home. Rode into street food where we were supposed to eat. And when I got my sandwich, I had to eat it on the street. Ride on. Blues and a red, ride on. Ride on to your freedom. Make the northern state your home.
Ride on, Red, Ride On by Louisiana Red. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're talking about the new documentary, The Green Book, Guide to Freedom, which will premiere Monday on Smithsonian Channel. I want to go to another clip.
One black resort in Northwest Michigan would become legendary, Idlewild.
My dad was a lawyer in Detroit. And he purchased land when I was 7 and built this house. So I've been here since I was 7 years old, and now I'll be 78. This was a place that you were free to bike, we were free to swim, we were free to just visit with each other and have a wonderful time. And we would ride every morning. And then come home and have lunch, and then go to the beach in the afternoon. You met your friends, you played cards, you swam, and you had fun for the afternoon until the 6 o'clock whistle. And then you had to come home.
During its heyday in the 1950s, Idlewild was one of the largest resort communities in the Midwest. The beating heart of Idlewild's booming nightlife was the Flamingo Club, owned by developer Phil Giles.
First it was a bar and a patio. Then he added the club part. Then that's when it became the Flamingo Club. And he really put Idlewild on the map. It was just nothing but people, nothing but people. Senators, political people, everybody came to Idlewild. I was born and reared here. I'm 81 years old. So those were my mentors. The ladies were so glamorous and they dressed so glamorous and the men were, to die for. This place was so full all the time. They'd run out of spaces to live, accommodations, no hotel rooms, nothing left. They would take their baths in the lake and then change and dress out of their cars. But they wasn't gonna leave Idlewild.
World-famous performers entertained the visitors to the resort. Among them, Louis Armstrong and Dinah Washington.
They were singing and jamming on the inside. I was their waitress. Sarah Vaughan was my lady. And I waited on, and when I carried her change, she had gave me a $100 bill. She said, "Keep the change, darling."
A clip from The Green Book, Guide to Freedom, premiering Monday on Smithsonian Channel, Idlewild, the significance, the dignity of it, and how it stands today.
I'm so happy you played that clip, Amy. That's one of my favorite parts of the film, that we got to show this community, and there are many communities like it all over the country, where African Americans developed this community for themselves, to have vacation and relax in safety and a safe haven. That's what everybody said when we went up there and filmed.
And let's be clear, this is the North.
This is the North. This is in Northwest Michigan, Upper Michigan, and it's such a beautiful place. The history is amazing. The development started in 1910 by one of the first African-American heart surgeons at University of Chicago. These people have been there for generations, and they have such pride in their community. At its heyday, as it says in the film, there were at one point it was the biggest resort in the Midwest, black or white. And today, of course, it's not, the heyday that it was, but folks are trying to redevelop the buildings, encourage people to come back. There are events there. And as one of the characters, one of the subjects says in the film, the soil is so rich, you really feel it when you're there.
And you're going to be having a showing in Detroit.
That's right. We are screening in Detroit on Monday night, the night of the broadcast. So I'm really excited. We have somebody from Idlewild who's going to be on our panel, Jamon Jordan, who's in the clip. So it's going to be great.
I wanted to turn to the 1949 edition of the Negro Motorist Green Book. On the cover, it says, "Carry your Green Book with you. You may need it." And under that is a quote by Mark Twain, "Travel is fatal to prejudice." Inside on page 3, just after the introduction, is a column by Wendell P. Alston, a special representative of the Esso Standard Oil Company, titled "The Green Book Helps Solve Your Travel Problems." Alston writes, quote, "The Negro traveler's inconveniences are many, and they are increasing because today so many more are traveling individually and in groups." On the next page is a picture of Alston along with James A. Jackson with the caption, "Special representatives of Esso marketers in their New York office." Talk about the role of Esso and these two African-American men in the Green Book.
Absolutely. That was one of the most interesting discoveries that we had in making this film. Esso gas station, which was Standard Oil, owned by Standard Oil, which was owned by Rockefeller, had a very early program to promote to African Americans, and not only that, but to hire African American scientists and chemists. He was married to a woman named Spelman. Her last name was Spelman. They come from a long line of abolitionists. Spelman College, the HBCU in Atlanta, was created by their family. So there was a history of this corporate behemoth working with the African-American community. And they distributed the Green Book at their Esso gas stations. And that is how, one of the ways that the Green Book was able to, be so widely distributed and so popular.
You also talk about the women entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. The women, the stories that we were finding and that we were coming upon, so many of them were women-owned businesses. And at one point, I start looking through the pages of the Green Book. They're all online. The Schomburg has them all online, so anybody can look up their town to see what's listed. But there are all these pictures of women owners, of women business owners. They had sent in their pictures. They were advertising in it, and everything from restaurants and motels and hotels. So Black women entrepreneurship is something that is a part of our experience and a part of our history.
Are you astounded in these last 30 seconds that you had heard nothing about the Green Book when you were asked to do this documentary?
It was divine timing. I mean, no, it's amazing. This is. What I am also very excited about is that the fiction film has given visibility to this piece, and hopefully people will, their interest will be piqued by the fiction film, no matter what happens on Sunday night, and then they will come and watch this documentary.
So the Oscars Sunday night, and your film, The Green Book Guide to Freedom, will premiere on Monday night on Smithsonian Channel. Yoruba Richan, director and writer of The Green Book Guide to Freedom, professor in the documentary program in the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is currently accepting applications for full-time one-year paid news fellowship. Details at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Noreen Shea, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Rabbi Karen, Hani Massoud. Special thanks to Miriam Barnard, Julie Crosby. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey.